If the 5th edition lore found in 2016's Curse of Strahd adventure is your only or main exposure to the history of the von Zarovich family and the realm of Barovia, then this volume of Ravenloft Discovery may surprise you. This series is a chronicle of Ravenloft that is currently set to consist of 4 volumes, but if I'm being pragmatic, will likely expand beyond even that. And today we will be uncovering all the origin lore surrounding Barovia and the von Zarovich bloodline in the era before and leading up to Strahd's transformation into the vampire of legend. Don't worry though, Volume 3 will begin where this volume ends and cover every facet of lore you need to know to survive in the domain of dread. However, before we start, I want to take just a moment to frame everything this series will share. The Ravenloft setting, perhaps more than any other, is steeped in rich storytelling and lore, which the 5e resources truly only brush the surface of. Yet, the longer lore rests on the pages of history, the more it is shaped under the weight of time and the changing views of mortal authors, and Ravenloft is no different. The origin and histories of the realm of Barovia have lore that is now over 4 decades removed from its 1983 introduction. This means new editions and the many new authors of those editions, each with their own goals and aspirations. Each new edition is influenced, right or wrong, by the changing dynamics of an evolving player base, and even cultural shifts from the real world, all inevitably leaving their mark upon the lore. What emerges from all these influences over the many decades is a collection of ideas, histories, and narratives that sometimes align beautifully, and other times clash dramatically. This volume, this channel, aims to uncover all the lore, reconciling where possible to present something as close to version agnostic as possible, thereby providing you all the lore you need to decide your truth on a table-by-table basis. I tell you this because in this series we will encounter many of those conflicts and inconsistencies, and you will hear lore that flies in stark contrast to what is printed on the pages of the 5th edition histories. From new lore introduced in 5e, such as the Amber Temple, Vestige Powers, or the Hag Babala Saga and her intimate connection to Strahd, to the origins of Barovia's founding, lost settlements and forgotten wars, and the very construction of Castle Ravenloft itself. So I ask you to have an open mind, consider all the lore we discover, and perhaps view or even embrace these contradictions as opportunities for your own creativity. Ravenloft is an amazing setting, and we have much to discover. The history of Barovia, now forever enshrined within the domains of dread, began far from the thick and ever-present mists of Ravenloft, and long before its legendary and infamous lore would be colored with the crimson hues of a tragic bloodline. Yet, like dark shadows grow with the fall of the sun, the heritage of the von Zarovich family was ultimately fated to succumb to the horrors of darkness. Centuries before the realm would become eponymous with the Transylvanian-like Gothic horrors of Bram Stoker's Dracula, Barovia was a vibrant nation kingdom of green valleys and towering peaks, established upon the lands of the prime material plane. Ruled by independent city-states, Barovia was a realm governed by families of status, wealth, and the nobility of their ancient blood. The aristocratic houses of Delisnia, Boritsi, Petronova, and Katsky united under the von Zarovich bloodline, forging a nation bound by tradition and fostering a history both illustrious and somber. The records are sparse, marred by the passage of time, many wars, and faded memories, yet certain historical events remain, highlighted with unsettling clarity. It was in year 1 of the Barovian calendar, or BC, that the nation of Barovia was established. The realm's founding also created a union of city-states to the west, namely the semi-independent regions of Borgia, which the earliest lore suggests was the prime material name for the domain we would come to know as Borca before it was claimed by the Mists nearly 7 centuries later in 684 BC. The wealthy mercantile and banking families of Cosco, Baritsi, Olzanik, and Delisnia used their wealth to purchase title and influence in the new nation of Barovia and in Borgia, strengthening ties between the two regions and ultimately blurring borders to the point that Borgia was now seen as part of Barovia. Some of the earliest surviving histories of the region date back into the 2nd century and center around the realm's theocracy and the first significant deity whose influence would be adopted and accepted realm-wide. These ancient religious records indicate the formal founding of a church dedicated to a tribal sun god named Andral. Its teaching and dogmatic practices officially sanctioned by the von Zarovich rulership to become Barovia's official religion around the year 168 BC. These chronicles, now 6 centuries old, confirm that the faith of Andral was at one time widespread, but seemingly died out in the 4th century. Little else remains known today about the specific teachings of the Church of Andral, as its doctrines and temples were gradually replaced by the veneration of other entities, particularly the Morning Lord and Mother Night. Traces of the sun god's theology and worship have mostly faded and dissolved over the centuries, leaving only remnant whispers found in a few dusty tomes and the single crumbling remains of a church that today decays in the town of Valaki. The most well-known era of the von Zarovich line began with the birth of Barof von Zarovich in 277 BC, followed by his future wife Ravinia von Royen. It should be noted here that the 5th edition history found in the Curse of Strahd resource would later correct her name as Ravenovia to better align with the naming conventions found in Eastern European heritage. The family tree provided in the Realm of Terror box set from 1990 confirms the von Zaroviches would produce 3 sons. The first and most infamous, Strahd, born in 299, Sturm, the middle son, born in 312, and the last, Sergei, 25 years Strahd's junior, was born in 324 BC. This family tree also illustrates the stark reality that all known von Zarovich descendants living to this day are descended from the most unremarkable of the brothers, the middle son Sturm, who with his wife Giselle von Zarovich would sire and save the von Zarovich bloodline. Later histories would find other descendants of the von Zarovich heritage, but these would be introduced in later products and their versions or revisions of the lore. Regardless, the patriarch, Count Barov, or king if you only follow 5th edition lore, would lead this realm of the prime material plane into an era of prosperity. The proud and noble nation of Barovia would flourish under his rule, growing steadily. However, so too would the many threats that opposed it. If you enjoy and/or find any value in these long-form essays, perhaps consider showing your support over on my Patreon, where I have an ever-growing collection of world-building resources to populate and enhance your adventures and worlds. You can check it all out for free and join with 0 obligation. You don't have to spend a dime unless you want to. Links are below, and a sincere thank you to my supporters that make this video possible. 3 historic events would come to mold the prime material realm of Barovia in a time before it would be ripped from its place among mortals to become a domain of dread. The first of these might have been forgotten, lost to the fragilities of time, if not for surviving records from the domain of Gundarak, as well as an ancient ballad from the early 3rd century called Blood of Mazon, a song that lamented the brutality of a warmongering people known as the Nuranai. They thundered from the east, a tide of blades and frothing fury. They rode like demons on their steeds and slew our children. Without a thought, no sanctuary could be found against them, and no force of men or gods could halt their advance. It would be in 230 BC when the barbarians of the Nuranai horde would set their sights upon the valley kingdom of Barovia. And while that battle hymn would not prove prophetic, as the realm's forces, led by the legendary General Princess Nicoletta von Zarovich, did in fact halt their advance. Still, the incursion managed to progress west through Svalich Pass to cross the Balanok Mountains and besiege the city of Valaki, holding it for 3 months before they were eventually defeated. However, despite the ballad's inaccuracies, its words still prove enlightening to our discoveries, providing a glimpse into the Nurenai culture as a nomadic and marauding tribe of savage horseback warriors. What I find most interesting is the perspective from which the blood of Mazan is delivered. If we take the ballad at face value, then the second line, calling the Nurenai demons that slew their children, clearly tells us this was likely written from the victim's point of view, lending the words a level of historic credibility. That, or perhaps we have found a very early piece of bardic propaganda. The lore also points to remnant evidence of their culture that suggests the Nurenai people worshipped a demon lord named Erlik Khan, who may have been a vestige, an aspect, or perhaps even a corrupted alternative name for a death god named Erlin, who was worshipped by the people of Gundurok. Gundurok, for those unfamiliar, was a core domain in the 2nd edition lore, originally ruled by a far less infamous and significantly more unfortunate vampire lord named Duke Nar of Gundar. First introduced in the 1990 Realms of Terror box set, Duke Gundar would be betrayed and staked in the heart circa 736 BC. The lands of Gundurok themselves would be absorbed by Barovia and Nvidia, no, not the land of GPUs, just 4 years later in the Grand Conjunction, an event we will explore later in this series. All this at least intimates that the Kingdom of Gundurok and the Nurenai Horde share a common lineage. One final lore nugget on the Nurenai: the Balok word Nuri is synonymous with shapeshifters and the lycanthropic legends of werewolves, adding yet another compelling facet supporting the Nurenai as a monstrous or demonic horde. A second pivotal facet of history would take place approximately 84 years after the Nurenai rampage. In 314 BC, just a year shy of Strahd's sweet 16 birthday, but more importantly, after nearly a century of power struggles between 3 of the noble Barovian houses, the Deliznia, the Katsky, and Petranova families, a dangerous conflict was ignited over control of the rich silver mines that had been discovered in the foothills of Mount Gries along Barovia's eastern border. History would go on to call this conflict the War of Silver Knives, but in truth, it was far less a war than a series of insurgent strikes, skirmishes, and some notable political assassinations. The latter first began with the murder of Isabella de Lisnia, the Borca matriarch of that family. This noble bloodshed would result in 2 years of open confrontations, killings, and vows of revenge. The assassination had been blamed upon both the Katsky and the Petranova families, only adding fuel to the already growing hostilities and accumulated ill will between the families over nearly the last century. While certainly not a war, this strife would have far-reaching ripple effects. Patriarch of the von Zarovich family, ruler of the nation and father of the young Strahd, Count Barof von Zarovich commanded an end to the hostilities just over 2 years later in 316. While the edict was followed to create an uneasy peace, within House Deliznia it was met with great displeasure and fostered the early seeds of resentment. A powerful family of noble bankers, House Deliznia felt betrayed by what they perceived as the inaction of the von Zaroviches, believing the death of their matriarch went unpunished, denying the prideful Deliznias their much sought-after justice and retribution. The Deliznias would not forget the slight, serving as a revenge-filled omen and a portent of things to come. Nevertheless, the War of the Silver Knives would leave the kingdom weakened, the distraction and fractured unity that resulted forging a path ahead for one of the most significant events in Barovian history. Fast forward just 4 years in Barovian history, now 90 years removed from the failed barbaric onslaught of the Nurenai, and we find another invasion of the realm, but this time from an enemy driven by a higher power. Led by Durakhan the Unstoppable, better known by his Balok named Dorian, This Turkish onslaught came from the east and was dissimilar from the Nuranai aggression in one very critical way. While many historical retellings tend to lump the Turks and the Nuranai as just another barbaric horde, this is simply not accurate. The Turks were not only more sophisticated, they introduced the added element of religious zealotry. The Turks believed they had a divine mandate to seize and control Barovia. And if you know anything about the history of religious wars such as the Crusades, then you also know that an opposing force that truly believes they have been destined by any higher power instantly become a far more dangerous adversary. This analysis would prove accurate in the case of the Turks. These fierce and religious zealots bordering on the fanatical worshipped a god named Zagaz, who is also referred to as Zavar in many texts. The Turkish invaders were vastly different from the barbaric hordes in that they did not seek to raze their conquests to the ground, accumulate the spoils of war, and then move on. No, instead, the Turks sought to conquer and settle Barovia to bring the whole under the eye of their god to spread the culture and dogmas of their faith. Turkish forces, marshaled by the fearless leadership of Durakan, quickly overwhelmed Barovia, decimating each of the noble families. But none worse than the von Zaroviches, forced to abandon Castle Barovia and flee westward, eventually finding sanctuary in the regions of Berez and Kresk. The realm would look to answer the Turk aggression and occupation with the coming of age of Strahd von Zarovich. Now 22, Strahd had climbed the ranks of military leadership as the young conqueror began an enduring campaign to reclaim the land and honor of his family. In the coming years of a decades-long war with the Turkish invaders, Strahd would prove to be a skilled combatant, wise leader, and a genius of military tactics. However, the tragedies of the von Zarovich bloodline had only just begun. After 26 years of bloody, visceral, and unrelenting war, in the year 346 BC, the fate of the von Zarovich lineage and the destiny of Barovia both seemed to be doomed when the Turks achieved their greatest victory in battle. A decisive victory that resulted in the death of Count Barov, killed in battle, and Strahd's mother, the Countess Ravenlovia, massacred in the aftermath. Despite the tragedy, just 1 year later, the warmongering General Strahd still managed to rally the Barovian forces and reverse the course of war, with a little fiendish assistance. The year is 347 BC, and both of Strahd's parents have now been killed by the occupying force of Turkish zealots. But we know that Strahd would reclaim the valley and the realm of Barovia. Now, if all this seems a little too Deus Ex Machina level of convenient, then you have likely only been exposed to the modern lore of the 5th edition. You see, the most well-worn paths of Ravenloft lore would lead most to conclude that Strahd's first interaction with the evils of dark entities would begin with his bargain for the dark gift of immortality, his transformation into the vampire lord that we all know and despise. But that would not be accurate, at least not in anything but perhaps the streamlined lore of the 5e text. In 347 BC, 4 years before he would seal that most defining dark bargain, Strahd came to terms on another sinister accord. As the now 48-year-old and General Strahd prepared for what would become the single most critical battle for the fate of the realm, he was approached by a greater daemon, a jackal-faced Yugoloth known as an Arcanoloth named Inajira. The fiend offered Strahd what he most desired, certain victory over the realm's invaders and the ability to reclaim his homeland. Inajira proffered a Faustian pact that promised Strahd's forces would be undefeatable and he would successfully drive the foreign invaders from his land. All for the low price of what the lore of the 2nd edition resource Roots of Evil shrewdly states was unknown concessions. But I think we can all agree that despite that vague and cagey text, the exchange was, of course, the daemon's control of Strahd's afterlife. Inajira, like most all fiends, thrived on the commerce of souls, the daemon's book of keeping serving as both a record of his mortal contracts and a symbol of his standing among the fiends of Gehenna in the lower planes. Strahd, ever pragmatic, accepted the terms, but in a legendary flash of his cunning and charisma, was able to convince Inajira to lend him the Book of Keeping as collateral, which, in this narrator's opinion, makes Inajira one of the most naive of fiends. Still, the bargain was struck, and in the year 347 BC, after almost 3 decades of blood-soaked battlefields, Strahd and his Barovian forces defeated the Turks to reclaim his homeland and rulership over the realm. All's well that ends well, I guess. At least for Strahd anyway, because the outcome did not unfold as Inajira had anticipated. When the Dark Powers, as part of the most well-known of Strahd's curses, ripped Barovia from the material plane, so too was the Fiend's Book of Keeping. For Inajira, this was a blunder of epic proportions. Stripped of his artifact, he became a pariah among his kind, his status shattered by a mortal's treachery. Exiled from Gehenna, the Arcanoloth's humiliation drove him to obsession, and for centuries he has long sought to recover the book and exact vengeance upon Strahd. In the 27 years the Turks held control of the realm, they had converted the ancestral home of the von Zaroviches, what had previously been called Castle Barovia, into a mighty Turkish fortress dedicated to their deity Zagaz. After driving the Turks from the land, Strahd claimed the bastion once again as the Barovian seat of power, and immediately set out to expand the construction and design of the Turkish bulwark in his own image. Just over 2 years later, in 349, the towering dark stone castle of now Gothic architecture was complete. Strahd named the great spired citadel Ravenloft, after his mother, Ravenovia. Castle Ravenloft was a monument to both his victory and his lingering despair, yet as the final stones of the castle were laid, so too were the foundations of Strahd's ultimate downfall. It was during this time that Sergei would arrive by invitation to take up residence in the vast cold stone halls of Castle Ravenloft. Strahd's youngest brother, Sergei, was a sibling he had barely known, himself 25 and in the maelstrom of war at the time of his birth, yet he was among the last of his immediate family. The arrival of his brother should have been a moment of family reunion and joy, but instead it quickly became only a catalyst for yet more tragedy. Sergei arrived at Castle Ravenloft untouched by war's horrors, his youth and vitality a cruel mirror reflecting all that Strahd had sacrificed, all that he had been denied. He was everything Strahd was not, charming, innocent, young, and filled with an unshakable sense of hope, nurtured by a mother that kept him from the horrors of war that Strahd had endured his entire adult life. While Strahd had spent decades bathed in the blood of Barovia's enemies, Sergei had grown up cherished and protected, their mother's favorite son. Every glimpse of Sergei's unlined face was a painful reminder of a vitality Strahd had long since lost, of a life he could have led, a life he should have had. Not long after Sergei's arrival in Barovia, the arrival of another would alter the destinies and fates of every soul across the entire realm, Tatiana Fedorovna. The lore is contradictory on her lineage. Some claim she was a maiden of humble heritage, others assert she was of noble blood. Regardless, Sergei and Tatiana would quickly fall in love. She was a woman of unparalleled beauty who captured the hearts of all who met her, including Strahd von Zarovich. Her radiance had pierced Strahd's war-hardened heart like no blade ever could. Her auburn hair, soft voice, and warm eyes awakened something in him that decades of warfare had long buried: desire. For Sergei, it had been love at first sight, but for Strahd it was something far darker. Despite knowing her involvement with Sergei, Tatiana became his obsession. In her, Strahd saw not only the beauty of youth, but perhaps a final chance to reclaim what he believed he had been denied: love, passion, happiness. He lavished her with gifts, attention, and promises of a life beyond her wildest dreams, a life Sergei could never offer. But Tatiana rejected him at every turn. To her, Strahd was a figure of commanding respect, authority, even a protector of the realm, but never a lover, and never a love. Her heart belonged entirely and completely to the young Sergei. This rejection festered in Strahd's ever-chilling heart, twisting his initial affection into a toxic blend of envy, lust, and a desire for that which he could not possess. Strahd's obsession with the young Tatiana would know no bounds, a dark compulsion blooming like a poisonous flower in the gardens of Castle Ravenloft. The more she turned to Sergei, the more Strahd's jealousy rotted until it consumed his every waking moment and tormented his restless nights. As the days turned to months and the new year turned to 350 BC, Strahd would learn his days of conflict were far from over. Not all were content with Count Strahd's position of power and authoritarian rule over the realm, and it would be in this new year that Strahd would survive an attempt by assassins from the Baal Verzai to take his life. While the history books failed to uncover the scheming behind the attempt, many believed, including Strahd, that the Delisnia and/or the Boritsi families were behind the plot. Despite the assassination attempt, the year 351 BC would begin with a proclamation that Sergei would wed the fair auburn maiden Tatiana in the summer. What should have been a cause for celebration instead served as a catalyst that would forever alter the fate of the realm. The news spread quickly, and the people of Barovia saw in Sergei and Tatiana a symbol of hope and renewal. For Strahd, however, the news proved unbearable. Where Sergei's joy was unbridled, Strahd's own longing had darkened into something unholy. Unable to accept Tatiana's devotion to his brother and unwilling to confront the limitations of his own mortality, Strahd resolved to reclaim both her and the vigor he believed was denied him unjustly. Desperate and tormented, Strahd began the dark research of ancient tomes, discovering the secrets of the Amber Temple, a forgotten sanctuary hidden deep within the icy crags of Mount Gakis. Legends told of a vault of forbidden knowledge where great sacrifice could yield even greater gifts. The temple, its halls frozen and suffused with an eerie amber light, was meant as a prison for impious vestiges, shards of dark entities long erased from mortal memory. Among them, one vestige made its presence known. Strahd encountered Vampire, a terrible winged monstrosity. The vestige would offer a dark gift, but the price was steep. Whether Strahd's communion with the unholy Vampire was an act of desperation or a calculated and cold ambition may never be known. But Strahd sought immortality, not for the fear of death, but for the power it promised and the heart he longed for. The vestige, sensing Strahd's hunger and obsession, made its offer: eternal life and unmatched power in exchange for the blood of someone he loved. Strahd, logic eroded, his mind afflicted by a lethal obsession and an irrational hatred born of jealousy for a brother that had only loved him, struck the unholy pact without hesitation. As summer approached, Castle Ravenloft became a hive of activity, with preparations for the wedding in full swing. Nobles from across Barovia and beyond were invited to witness the union, their invitations delivered by couriers who spoke in reverent tones of the grandeur to come. Strahd, outwardly gracious and composed, concealed well the tempest of betrayal to come. On the day of the wedding, Castle Ravenloft was resplendent, its halls filled with laughter, music, and the clinking of goblets. Guests marveled at the opulence of the feast, unaware of the storm clouds looming over the celebration. Strahd, clad in ceremonial armor that gleamed like polished obsidian, moved along the revelers with a sinister calm that belied his true intent. His plan was set: Sergei would die, and Strahd's immortal transformation would be complete. But today would see a somber convergence of the vile and villainous. As Strahd planned his own betrayal, another treachery was brewing. Leo Deliznia, long harboring resentment toward the von Zarovich rule, had smuggled his own sinister agents into the celebration under the guise of his court. They were in actuality assassins of the Baal Versailles. The patriarch of the Deliznia family planned to gain his retribution and seize control of the realm on this day. But Strahd's darkness would prove the swifter of evils. As the ceremony began in the castle's grand chapel, Strahd led Sergei aside under the guise of a private blessing. The chapel's vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows bore witness to the atrocities unfolding. Strahd hugged his brother tight as a silver blade struck deep into Sergei's heart. The chapel floor ran red with Sergei's blood at the hands of a brother he had always admired and loved. As the celebrating aristocracy gasped in shock as the groom fell, any confusion over what had befallen was soon made crystal clear as Strahd began drinking his brother's blood, the last step in receiving his promised dark gift. Sergei's collapse to the crimson-stained stone would be followed by the screams of his bride-to-be, echoing through Castle Ravenloft as she fled to the castle's ramparts above, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a ghost shroud. Strahd would pursue, his voice a mix of pleading and command, attempted to convince her that he was her true love, but his words were hollow, now corrupted by the darkness coursing through him. Leo Deliznia, surprised by the events but not altogether unpleased, gave the Baal Versailles assassins the nod to follow Strahd and carry out their orders of execution. The culmination of this supreme intersection of many evils would take place high on the ramparts of Castle Ravenloft. Tatiana stood at the edge, her gaze fixed on the swirling mist below. Strahd reached out to her, professing his love while at the same time demanding her submission. The auburn-haired bride-to-be, tears streaming down her face, shook her head slowly. Her heart was shattered and her soul repulsed by the monster standing before her. Tatiana had made her choice. With one final defiant look, she cast herself from the heights, her body vanishing into the mist, Strahd powerless to stop her. As Strahd stood in stunned silence, Leo Deliznia seized upon his opportunity. The trained killers of the Baal Versailles struck with precision, their poison bolts finding their mark. Strahd fell, his body riddled with venom and wounds that would have felled any mortal man. But Count Strahd von Zarovich was a mortal man no more. Death, now a stranger to Strahd, could no longer claim him. The dark gift of immortal undeath surged within, reborn as the first vampire lord. Rising from the throes of mortal death, Strahd unleashed his fury as the castle became a slaughterhouse of carnage. The vampire lord tore through the Baal Versailles assassins and any who had allied themselves with the Deliznia noble. As the last echoed screams of the massacre faded, the air in Castle Ravenloft grew heavy, tainted by the worst evils of men and their unchecked ambitions and desires. Strange mists descended from the Balanok Mountains as the sun's light dimmed and the once vibrant skies of the realm grew overcast. Barovia would never be the same. The ultimate fate of Leo Deliznia is fractured across the historical texts. The lore from Strahd's own memoirs, found in the novel I, Strahd, are the very definition of an unreliable narrator, going so far as to absurdly suggest that Strahd had no hand in Sergei's murder, a treacherous act of betrayal by assassins of the Baal Versailles at the order of the Deliznia Patriarch. The most reliable accounts can be found in the 3rd edition lore from the Ravenloft Gazetteer Volume 1. On page 13 we learn that very few escaped Castle Ravenloft that day, but among them were Leo Deliznia and Lavinia Wachter, who would have a role yet to play. Leo, knowing the weight that his betrayal would carry, went into hiding, rightly fearing the vengeance of the vampire lord. He would also be one of the first to discover that escape from Barovia to other lands would be impossible, noting that a malevolent force had raised thick mists to enclose the realm. The sinister patriarch would seek refuge in the Monastery of Silver Threads, hidden in the Baratok Mountains. Many years later, with the help of Lavinia Wachter, Strahd would at last come for his vengeance. Strahd ended Leo's life, but not his existence, turning him into a vampire spawn while sealing him away deep in a tomb on the Wachter estate, left to be driven mad by hunger. The lore again fractures, with some texts confirming Leo would eventually expire. Others say he escaped. Regardless, on that fate-filled summer day in 351 BC, when Strahd tasted the copper tang of his brother's blood, his destiny and that of this realm would forever be locked in eternal misery. A pall of dread enveloped the valley that day as the mist forever detached Barovia from the remainder of the world. This land, the dark realm of the Vampire Lord, were now a reflection of its master's cruelty and corruption. The dark powers took Strahd as their own, and by the bond that Strahd bore to the land, the realm accompanied him, becoming the first, but certainly not the last, of the domains of dread. Thanks so much for joining me on this continuing Ravenloft deep dive. We still have a lot to cover. As you likely have noticed, what started as a 3-part series has already grown to 4, and I reserve the right to add more as the lore warrants. And that does not even include the many future videos we will produce dedicated to the various domains of dread not called Barovia. A special thank you to my YouTube channel members and my supporters over on Patreon, who through their generous support make this video possible. If you'd like to support my work, it's a win-win by joining my Patreon, where I have an ever-growing collection of DM and world-building resources. You can check it all out and join for free with no obligation. Links below. And finally, if you think I earned it, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. Thanks for listening, and until next time, remember, the only limitation at your table is your imagination.